The New York State Housing Finance Agency was the country's first HFA, creating the model for financing affordable housing across the country. Our story begins in the 1950s. There was a severe shortage of rental housing for middle-income residents in the state. Many were moving from the cities to the suburbs, threatening to worsen urban blight, especially in New York City. In 1955, the state legislature created a financing program using private capital to build middle-income housing. Today, that law is known for its sponsors, Senator McNeil Mitchell and Assemblyman Alfred Lama. To fund Mitchell-Lama housing, the state needed to borrow money. That required voter approval. But year after year, voters rejected housing bond issues. In 1958, Nelson Rockefeller ran for governor, calling for more middle-income housing. Soon after his election, he reached out to a well-regarded bond attorney, John Mitchell, the same John Mitchell who later served as United States Attorney General. Mitchell suggested selling bonds backed by a reserve fund, a fund created with the payments generated by the housing projects financed by the bonds. Any shortfall in the reserve fund would be made up by state appropriation. Though there was no legal obligation, the legislature had the moral obligation to fund the shortfall. Thus, moral obligation bonds were born. On February 23, 1960, Rockefeller asked the legislature to create a housing finance agency. It is essential, he said, for government to help develop the programs necessary to attract adequate investment of private capital to meet the critical housing needs of families and persons of middle income. Just 2 months later, on April 20, 1960, Governor Rockefeller signed the law creating the first HFA. It authorized the new agency to sell $525 million in bonds to make low-interest mortgage loans to private sponsors of housing for middle-income families. The governor said HFA will establish a self-sustaining, long-term program to stimulate construction of private housing for our middle-income residents. The first HFA bond issue was set for the summer of 1961, but the capital markets had never seen municipal bonds quite like these before, requiring the new HFA to undertake a special marketing effort aimed at insurance companies and underwriting firms. The salesmanship was a big success. The first $51.8 million of bonds, issued on July 12, 1961 for 4 Mitchell-Lama projects, were rated AA and sold out immediately. HFA's methods were a radical change in how public-private projects were financed and were soon replicated across the country. Mayors and governors used moral obligation bonds to build not just housing, but also roads, bridges, and electric grids. By 1975, 79 public authorities in 30 states had been modeled after New York's HFA. In New York, housing developers rushed to HFA to seek low-cost financing. Among the first, Fred Trump, Donald's father, who proposed what would become Trump Village in Coney Island. But Trump ran into trouble during construction. He asked the HRH construction company to take over the project. The R in HRH stands for Ravitch. HRH was the family construction business of our current lieutenant governor. HFA has evolved a great deal since those early days. Rockefeller quickly expanded the agency's mandate to include financings of state universities, nursing homes, hospitals, youth facilities, and senior citizen centers. In the 1970s, the world of housing changed. The fiscal crisis forced the agency to retrench. Meanwhile, high interest rates and rising construction costs made financing of Mitchell-Lama housing increasingly unrealistic. So, HFA redirected its efforts towards building and renovating low-income, affordable housing. Most notably, HFA financed housing projects supported by the Section 8 program, which relied on federal subsidies to very low-income tenants. In the 1980s, HFA began its 80-20 program, offering financing to private developers of market-rate housing if they reserved 20% of their units for affordable housing. In 1986, the Federal Tax Reform Act included a proposal by Congressman Charles Rangel to create low-income housing tax credits, and they quickly became the primary federal program to subsidize affordable housing. Meanwhile, the state created 2 new HFA subsidiaries, the Housing Trust Fund Corporation and the Affordable Housing Corporation, to fund grants supporting affordable housing. By the end of the decade, HFA started programs to create transitional and permanent housing for the homeless and to protect mobile homeowners. And in 1994, the state consolidated its housing finance agencies, co-locating Sunny Mae with HFA, creating what we now call NY Homes. By the turn of the new century, HFA worked to preserve the affordability of Mitchell-Lama projects that were starting to leave the program, putting thousands of tenants with affordable rents at risk. To protect tenants, And to improve living conditions in these 30 and 40-year-old developments, HFA financed major capital improvements in return for agreements to keep rents affordable for years to come. More recently, under the leadership of Priscilla Almodovar and with the support of Governor David Paterson, HFA doubled the number of affordable housing units it financed through new construction and preservation. The agency also helped build 769 units of supportive housing and created alliances with government agencies and nonprofits that provide these services. In 1960, HFA showed the country how to leverage private capital to build affordable housing. In the years since, we have adapted to the changing needs of the marketplace, demonstrating what innovative housing finance can accomplish. The results have been impressive. $22.8 billion in bonds issued and more than 116,000 housing units created or preserved, including some of the largest affordable housing projects in the country. HFA looks forward to providing another 50 years of affordable housing to the citizens of New York State. Please give a well-earned round of applause to the men and women who led HFA over the past 50 years.